The first night I returned to Hollowmere, the moon was already waiting for me, low and patient above the black water of the lake, as if it had been watching the road long before my car's headlights curved through the trees, and I remember thinking that places do not forget, they do not forgive, they simply remain, holding the shape of what once happened inside them. And as I stepped out into the cold air, I felt something inside my chest tighten in a way that was not fear exactly, but recognition, the kind of recognition you feel when you walk into a room where someone has been speaking about you in whispers. The house stood exactly as it had 10 years ago, its roof sagging slightly, its porch boards gray and splintered, the windows reflecting the moon so perfectly that for a moment I could not tell where the sky ended and the glass began, and I understood with a strange calm that this was why I had never truly escaped, because you can leave a place, you can change cities, change jobs, change the sound of your voice if you try hard enough, but you cannot leave the unfinished parts of yourself behind. They follow you quietly, they grow in the dark, and when the light is right they stand up and wait for you to look at them. I had told everyone that I came back to sell the property, to clear legal matters after my mother's passing, but that was a convenient lie. The truth was simpler and far less comfortable. I came back because I was tired of running from the memory of that night by the lake. The night my younger brother Elias walked into the water beneath a full moon and did not return, and though they called it an accident, though they said the cold currents pulled him under, though they told me there was nothing anyone could have done, I knew that was not the whole story, because I had been there, I had heard the argument, I had said the words I cannot unsay. Words thrown carelessly in anger. Words that sounded harmless until they echoed back at me years later in empty rooms. And sometimes I still wake with the sensation that someone is standing at the foot of my bed, not accusing, not even angry, just waiting for me to admit something I have refused to speak aloud. The wind moved across the lake now in long silver strokes, the surface rippling like breath against glass, and as I carried my suitcase up the porch steps I felt the old boards shift under my weight, a soft complaining sound that reminded me of how Elias used to laugh when he ran across them as a child, reckless and alive, believing that nothing in the world could truly break him. And perhaps that is the cruelest thing about youth, not that it is fragile, but that it feels invincible right up until the moment it is not. Inside, the house smelled of dust and old wood, a faint trace of something metallic beneath it, and when I turned on the lights they flickered once before settling into a weak glow, as though even electricity hesitated to disturb the silence. I walked from room to room slowly, touching the backs of chairs, the edge of the kitchen table, the frame of the hallway mirror, half expecting to see some distortion in the reflection, some version of myself slightly out of alignment, because I have carried for years the quiet suspicion that the person who left Hollowmere was not the same person who has returned, that somewhere between anger and grief I misplaced something essential and never found it again. I paused at the back window where the lake was fully visible, the moonlight stretching across it in a pale road that seemed almost deliberate, and I remembered how Elias once said that on clear nights it looked like a path you could walk if you were brave enough. And I had laughed at him then, called him dramatic, told him to stop speaking as though the world revolved around his imagination. And I see now how easily we dismiss the tenderness in others when we are too busy defending our own pride. The memory pressed in harder than I expected, and I felt again that tightness in my chest, the old familiar guilt rising like cold water around my ribs, and before I could turn away I noticed something on the lake that did not move with the wind. A darker shape interrupting the silver, narrow and upright, too precise to be a shadow from the trees, too still to be a trick of the eye, and I leaned closer to the glass, telling myself it was nothing, that grief has a way of painting patterns where there are none, but the shape remained, faint yet undeniable, positioned directly along the line of moonlight, as if standing on that shimmering road. I blinked once, twice, and in that second between breaths it seemed taller, its outline sharper, not emerging from the water but contained within the reflection itself, as though the lake were a mirror and something on the other side had stepped closer. My pulse began to thud in my ears, not in panic but in a slow dawning awareness, and a thought formed with terrifying clarity. What if the reflection is not showing me the sky? What if it is showing me what I left unresolved? I stayed there longer than I should have, watching, waiting for it to dissolve, for logic to reassert itself. But the darker shape did not fade, it remained aligned with the moonlight, silent, patient, and I felt with a certainty that bypassed reason that it was not merely an image. It was attention, focused and deliberate, and though I could not see a face, I sensed the direction of its gaze, upward, toward the house, toward the window, toward me. Something inside me whispered that I should step away, draw the curtains, pretend I had seen nothing, and that voice sounded very much like the one I have listened to for years, the one that says do not dig deeper, do not examine too closely, do not reopen what has barely scarred over. Yet another voice, quieter but steadier, said that this was why I had returned, not to sell the house, not to sign documents, but to stand here and look without flinching. The wind rose suddenly, brushing against the walls with a low hum, and the surface of the lake shivered except for the narrow dark figure, which held its shape even as the reflection around it fractured, and I realized then that fear is not always loud, sometimes it arrives as stillness, as the understanding that you are being given a choice: continue to look away and carry this weight forever, or step closer to what you dread and risk discovering that it has been part of you all along. My hand rested against the cold glass, and for the first time since Elias disappeared I allowed myself to speak into the quiet room, not loudly, not dramatically, just a single sentence shaped by breath and regret: I am here. The words felt fragile, almost foolish, yet the moment they left my mouth the dark figure on the lake shifted, not dramatically, not rushing forward, but inclining slightly, as if acknowledging that it had heard me, and in that subtle movement I sensed not menace, but inevitability, like the beginning of a conversation that has been postponed for far too long. I did not sleep much that night. I lay in my old bedroom staring at the ceiling where faint cracks traced patterns I had memorized as a child, and every time I closed my eyes I saw the narrow silhouette standing within the moon's reflection, and I asked myself whether I truly believed in ghosts, or whether what I was witnessing was something more difficult to dismiss: the physical manifestation of guilt given form by memory and light. And if that were true, if the lake had become a mirror not of the sky but of my own unfinished grief, then the question was not what it wanted from me, but what I had refused to give. Sometime before dawn I rose and walked back to the window. The moon sinking lower now, its brightness thinning, and the dark shape was gone. The lake returned to ordinary ripples and shadow, almost disappointingly mundane. And yet the absence did not comfort me, because I knew with a calm I could not explain that it would return when the light was right again, and next time it might not remain at a distance. As the first gray of morning crept over Hollowmere I understood something I had avoided for a decade. Closure is not something granted by time, it is something earned by confrontation, and if the moon was going to offer me a reflection, I would have to decide whether I was strong enough to see all of it. Morning in Hollowmere does not truly arrive. It seeps in slowly like diluted ink, turning the edges of things gray before revealing their shape, and when I stepped outside just after sunrise the lake looked harmless, almost disappointingly ordinary, its surface a muted blue beneath a sky drained of drama, and for a brief, treacherous moment I wondered whether the dark figure of the night before had been nothing more than exhaustion stitched together with memory. Yet there is a particular kind of knowing that settles beneath logic, a quiet recognition that something has shifted inside you even if the world appears unchanged, and as I walked toward the water I felt that shift like a bruise pressed from within. The grass near the shore was brittle with frost, each blade catching the thin light, and I remembered how Elias used to kick through it barefoot even in the cold, claiming he wanted to feel everything fully, as though numbness were a greater danger than pain. And I had mocked him for that once, told him he was naive, told him the world would teach him differently, and perhaps it did. Perhaps it taught him more brutally than either of us expected. I crouched near the edge of the lake, studying the surface carefully, searching for any distortion, any lingering sign of what I had seen, but daylight is merciless in its simplicity. It flattens mysteries into reflections and excuses into shadows, and all I saw was my own face wavering faintly in the water. Older than I remember, eyes lined with years I prefer not to count. I leaned closer, watching how easily my features blurred when the slightest breeze touched the surface, and I thought about how identity works much the same way, how one sharp word spoken in anger can ripple outward and alter the image of who you believe yourself to be. I had not meant the things I said to Elias that night. That is what I told myself for years, that anger is temporary and therefore harmless, that siblings fight and reconcile and nothing irreversible happens. But memory is not so forgiving. It does not categorize intent, it records impact, and the last words he heard from me were not kind, they were sharp, dismissive, final in a way I did not understand at the time. I stood slowly, brushing frost from my hands, and tried to replay that evening in my mind with clarity rather than distortion. The argument began in the kitchen, something trivial about money, about responsibility, about who had sacrificed more for our mother after our father left, and beneath the surface of that argument was a deeper resentment I had never voiced, the resentment of being the older one, the expected one, the one who must be practical while Elias was allowed to be impulsive and bright. And I see now how envy disguises itself as irritation, how we convince ourselves we are correcting someone when in truth we are punishing them for being free in ways we no longer allow ourselves to be. He stormed out first, slamming the back door so hard the frame shook, and I followed minutes later, still burning with the need to win, because some part of me believed that being right was more important than being gentle. The moon was full that night too, enormous and white above the lake, and I can still hear the sound of his voice carried by the wind, accusing me of never listening, of always needing control, and I remember saying something cruel, something about how his dreams would drown him someday if he wasn't careful, and I said it lightly, sarcastically, as though it were a clever line rather than a curse. When he turned toward the lake, I thought he was simply walking away from me. I did not understand that despair can move quietly, that it does not always announce itself with tears or spectacle. Sometimes it is a stillness, a decision made inwardly long before the body follows. By the time I realized he was not coming back to the house, it was too late. The water had swallowed any explanation, any apology, any chance to rewrite the scene. The official report called it an accident, and I clung to that word because it offered distance. It implied randomness rather than responsibility. Yet deep inside I carried the suspicion that my anger had pushed him closer to the edge than he would have gone alone. And whether or not that suspicion is fact matters less than the way it has shaped me ever since. A sudden movement on the water pulled me back to the present, a ripple spreading outward without visible cause, and I froze, every nerve alert. But there was nothing there except the echo of my own breath, and I realized how quickly fear can take root once planted, how the mind begins to search for patterns even in emptiness. Still, as I turned to walk back toward the house, I felt watched again. Not from the trees, not from the shore, but from the thin line where sky meets reflection. And I resisted the urge to look over my shoulder because I sensed that whatever waited would prefer that I doubt myself, that I dismiss it as imagination, that I continue the old habit of avoidance. Inside, I began opening drawers and cabinets under the pretense of sorting belongings, but what I was truly searching for was proof, some trace that the night before had not been a hallucination born of grief. And in the bottom drawer of my mother's old desk I found something I had not seen in years, a small leather-bound notebook with Elias's handwriting on the cover, uneven and bold, and my chest tightened as though I had uncovered something fragile and alive. I sat at the kitchen table and opened it carefully, half expecting blank pages, half fearing what I might read, and the first entries were ordinary, sketches of ideas, fragments of poems, observations about the lake and the way moonlight changed its color, and I felt an ache I cannot describe, because his words carried a sincerity I had once dismissed as childish, and now I saw how brave it was to notice beauty without cynicism. As I turned the pages further, the tone shifted subtly, lines about feeling unheard, about standing in a room full of people and still sensing isolation, about wondering whether disappearing would make a louder statement than speaking ever had. And my vision blurred not from tears but from the weight of recognition, because I had read these lines before in different forms, in my own thoughts, in my own silent moments of doubt, and yet when they belonged to him I had labeled them dramatic rather than vulnerable. The final entry was dated the night he died, and it was shorter than the others, just a few sentences about the moon being both beautiful and merciless, about how it reveals what daylight politely hides. And there was one line that lodged itself inside me like a splinter. Sometimes the only way to see who you are is to stand where the light is strongest, even if it burns. And I closed the notebook slowly, my hands trembling, because I understood now that Elias had not been weak, he had been searching, and I had mistaken that search for recklessness. The house felt smaller suddenly, the air heavier, and as I rose from the table I sensed again that subtle shift in atmosphere, the faint hum beneath silence that suggests attention. I walked toward the back window almost unwillingly, drawn by a pull I could not justify, and though the sun was still high enough to dull the lake's surface, I saw, just for a fraction of a second, a darker vertical line interrupting the reflection. Gone as soon as I focused on it, like an afterimage burned into vision. My heart did not race this time, instead it steadied, as though preparing for something inevitable, and I realized that whatever I had seen the previous night was not merely a haunting, it was an invitation, a demand perhaps, to stop rewriting the past in ways that protected my pride. If the lake was becoming a mirror, then it would not show me Elias as I prefer to remember him, laughing and invincible. It would show me the moment where I failed to be the brother he needed, and the part of myself that has hidden from that truth. I pressed my palm lightly against the glass once more, not in fear but in acknowledgement, and whispered, almost without thinking, I will not look away again. And though nothing moved on the water, though the daylight remained stubbornly ordinary, I felt something respond within me, a quiet alignment between memory and courage, fragile yet real, and I knew that when night returned, when the moon rose again in full clarity, the reflection would be waiting, not to destroy me, but to test whether I am finally ready to stand in its light without flinching. Lena did not run this time. She stood at the edge of the clearing where the impossible doorway had vanished and forced herself to breathe slowly, because panic sharpened vision and sharp vision seemed to feed whatever intelligence hid behind the angles. So she softened her gaze and let the forest blur at the edges until the trees felt less rigid and more like silhouettes pressed against a dim sky. The ground beneath her boots was level again, yet she could not shake the sensation that something beneath the soil had rotated a fraction of a degree, as if an unseen mechanism had clicked into a new position. She turned in a slow circle and noticed that the shadows no longer pointed cleanly away from the sinking sun but bent slightly toward the lake, subtle enough that she might once have ignored it, impossible to ignore now. Elias's voice echoed in memory. You're measuring it wrong, Lena. You always measure from yourself. And she understood that she had been assuming her own perspective was fixed, stable, the reference point for everything else. But what if she was the variable being recalculated? A tremor passed through the air like a low-frequency hum, and the sound of pages turning drifted between the trees, not loud, not frantic, but steady, deliberate, as if someone were reading carefully and making notes. She followed the sound without hurrying, careful not to focus too hard on any single trunk or branch, and as she approached the lake she saw the surface reflecting not the sky but a darker gradient, a depth that suggested interior walls rather than open air. The dock creaked once under no visible weight and she stopped at its edge, remembering the warning not to let it see her looking. So she stared at the horizon instead and watched the reflection through the corner of her eye. The room beneath the water clarified instantly in her peripheral vision, the hanging bulb swaying in a rhythm that did not match the breeze. The wooden chair positioned at a slight tilt, one leg shorter than the others as though cut at the wrong angle. The journal lay open across the seat and she sensed rather than saw that the handwriting had changed again. Resisting the urge to kneel and peer directly down, she let her focus drift to the ripples spreading from the dock's shadow, and in that blurred awareness she perceived a figure standing behind the chair, thin and elongated, its outline intersecting the edges of the room in ways that made depth uncertain. She felt a pressure behind her eyes, a subtle pulling sensation as if her optic nerves were being drawn taut toward a vanishing point beneath the lake, and she realized the entity was aligning her, rotating her perception incrementally to match its own geometry. Fear flared, but she did not close her eyes. Instead she stepped sideways, breaking the straight line between herself and the center of the reflection, and the pressure faltered. The bulb flickered. The figure's outline fractured into jagged segments. She heard Elias then, not as a voice but as a memory layered over sensation. It completes itself through symmetry. Do not give it symmetry. Lena deliberately shifted her stance into an uneven posture, one shoulder lowered, head tilted slightly, gaze unfixed, and the water's image destabilized further, the room beneath stretching like a distorted photograph. The dock groaned as if bearing weight, yet nothing surfaced. A single ripple expanded outward from the exact midpoint of the lake, and for a heartbeat she saw the chair occupied, not by a clear body but by a convergence of lines, a knot of intersecting angles that folded in and out of one another. Nausea surged through her, but she kept her vision soft, refusing to grant it a clean outline. The knot twitched, seeking alignment, and when she refused to center it within her sight, the lake shuddered violently. Reflection breaking into chaotic fragments, the room dissolved, the chair blurred, the figure thinned into nothing. All at once the water mirrored only the bruised evening sky. The hum in the air faded and ordinary forest sounds crept back incautiously, as though testing whether it was safe. Lena remained at the dock a long time, aware that the danger had not ended but shifted, that she had not defeated the angle but denied it completion. As darkness settled fully over the lake, she turned away without once looking directly down, understanding now that survival did not depend on courage or escape but on perception itself, on the fragile discipline of never allowing the world to become perfectly centered again. Lena did not sleep when she returned to the cabin. She removed every mirror from the walls and laid them face down on the floor, covered the window panes with blankets, and unplugged the small television in the corner because even a black screen felt like an invitation. And as she moved through the narrow rooms, she noticed how often she relied on straight lines to steady herself. The edges of tables, the seams of door frames, the predictable 90-degree corners that made space feel trustworthy. Now each corner seemed suspect, as though it might open a fraction wider when unobserved. So she began marking faint pencil lines along the walls at eye level, crude reference guides to reassure herself that nothing had shifted overnight. By dawn, exhaustion forced her into a shallow sleep at the kitchen table, and she dreamed not of the lake but of blueprints spread across the wood, pages layered with intersecting grids. Every grid slightly rotated from the last until the pattern formed a spiraling distortion, and in the center of the spiral sat the wooden chair like a compass needle pinned through paper. She woke with the sensation that something had leaned close to examine her, not touching, merely studying, and she understood that avoidance alone would not end this because the phenomenon was adapting. If it completed itself through symmetry, then it would seek environments where symmetry was abundant, and no structure offered more obedient right angles than a house. She rose slowly and retrieved the carpenter's level again, pressing it against the north wall where she had once seen the bubble drift. And at first the bubble rested calmly between the lines, but as she watched without blinking it slid left, almost imperceptibly, as though reacting to the intensity of her focus. She forced her eyes to relax and the bubble corrected itself, confirming her fear that direct scrutiny fed the distortion. The hum returned then, faint but unmistakable, vibrating through the floorboards, and she felt a subtle tilt beneath her feet. Not enough to topple a glass but enough to unsettle balance. She stepped into the hallway and noticed the far doorway appeared narrower than it should, the top frame bending inward at a shallow angle that made the darkness beyond seem deeper. Resisting the urge to stare straight down the corridor, she angled her body and observed the frame from the corner of her eye, and immediately the wood grain warped, stretching toward a vanishing point that did not align with the ceiling. The hum intensified. Somewhere in the house a page turned. Lena's pulse quickened, yet she remembered Elias's warning about symmetry and deliberately knocked a stack of books from a shelf, scattering them unevenly across the floor to disrupt the clean geometry of the room. The hum faltered slightly, like a machine missing a beat. Encouraged, she dragged a chair into the hallway and tipped it onto two legs, creating imbalance, then pulled a rug halfway off-center so its edges no longer paralleled the walls. Each asymmetry felt like a small rebellion, a refusal to let the structure become a perfect diagram. The air grew colder, and from the kitchen came the creak of wood under sudden weight. She did not look directly, but in her peripheral vision she saw the outline of the wooden chair from beneath the lake now positioned at her kitchen table, its legs cut at uneven lengths, its backrest tilting at that impossible degree. The journal rested upon it, closed, waiting. She sensed that if she faced it head-on the room would align, walls snapping into new angles to accommodate the intruder. Instead she stepped sideways into the living room and spoke softly, not naming what stood behind her, not describing it, because language itself felt like measurement. The temperature dropped further, breath fogging faintly in the air. The hum vibrated through her ribs. She imagined the house as a grid and herself as a moving variable, and she began to walk in irregular patterns, never straight lines, never predictable arcs, disrupting any clean coordinate the entity might map. The chair scraped across the floor behind her with a slow, deliberate sound, matching her movements but always seeking to center itself within her awareness. She felt the pressure building again behind her eyes, the pull toward alignment, and she closed them briefly, not in fear, but in refusal, then reopened them unfocused, letting shapes blur. The scraping stopped. Silence expanded through the cabin. When she finally dared to glance toward the kitchen from an oblique angle, the borrowed chair was gone and her own table stood crooked, one leg slightly shorter than before as if something had shaved it down. Lena understood then that the phenomenon was no longer confined to the lake, that it had followed her not as a creature but as a principle, a geometry attempting to manifest wherever perception allowed. And as she stood amid the deliberately disordered rooms, she realized this was only the beginning of a contest not of strength but of perspective, a slow war over the angles of reality itself. By the fifth night, Lena understood that the house was no longer a shelter but a testing ground, and she moved through it carefully, maintaining deliberate asymmetry in every room, leaving drawers half open, angling picture frames slightly off level, stacking books unevenly so no clean vertical line could dominate the space. She had begun to think like the distortion, anticipating where symmetry might naturally reassert itself, disrupting it before the unseen geometry could take hold. Yet the effort exhausted her because order was instinct and chaos required intention. Near midnight, the hum returned stronger than before, vibrating through the pipes and window frames, and she felt a subtle inward pressure in the air as if the walls were inhaling. The kitchen light flickered once, twice, then steadied at a dimmer glow, casting long skewed shadows that converged toward the center of the floor. Lena refused to look directly at that convergence point and instead focused on the chipped paint along the far cabinet, softening her vision until edges lost precision. In that blurred awareness, she sensed the wooden chair forming again behind her, not arriving through motion but condensing from misaligned space, its legs phasing into existence at unequal lengths, its back tilted at that familiar impossible degree. The journal appeared atop it, pages fluttering though no wind stirred, and she heard Elias's voice not as sound but as pressure inside memory. "It will try to correct you, do not let it define straight." The floor beneath her feet shifted slightly, gravity tilting toward the chair's position, and Lena felt her posture unconsciously adjust to compensate, her body seeking equilibrium. She realized that even involuntary balance granted the entity information about her internal sense of vertical, so she deliberately leaned the wrong way, exaggerating imbalance until her muscles trembled. The hum faltered. The chair's outline wavered. A faint crack appeared in the air above it like stress-fracturing glass. Encouraged, she stepped sideways in uneven intervals, tracing a jagged path across the kitchen tiles, refusing any predictable pattern. The journal snapped shut with a sharp report, and for a heartbeat she felt the room attempt to rotate, walls skewing inward as though the cabin were folding along unseen creases. Nausea surged, but she kept her gaze unfixed, observing only the periphery where distortion revealed itself most clearly. The chair stretched vertically, thinning into intersecting lines, then multiplied into overlapping silhouettes, each misaligned by a few degrees. The pressure in her skull intensified, a silent demand to look straight, to resolve the blur into clarity. She understood that the entity fed on resolution, on the mind's urge to correct and center. And so she whispered to herself fragmented thoughts, unfinished sentences, denying cognitive symmetry as fiercely as spatial symmetry. The overlapping chairs began to collapse into one another, lines tangling and snapping like threads pulled too tight. A low cracking sound rippled through the room and the hum spiked into a sharp ringing tone before cutting abruptly to silence. When Lena finally risked a cautious glance, never directly, always from the corner of her eye, the kitchen appeared as she had left it, crooked and uneven but solid. Yet a new detail chilled her. The north wall bore a faint diagonal seam that had not existed before, running from ceiling to floor at a shallow angle, as though two slightly misaligned versions of the room had briefly overlapped and failed to merge cleanly. She approached the seam carefully, keeping her focus soft, and extended a trembling hand until her fingers brushed the surface. The wood felt colder along that line, subtly recessed, and for an instant she sensed depth beyond it, a narrow space where another version of the cabin leaned at a different tilt. She withdrew her hand quickly and stepped back, heart racing. The entity had not vanished but retreated, testing boundaries, leaving fractures where alignment had nearly succeeded. Lena understood with a clarity that frightened her more than any manifestation that this was an escalating negotiation between perception and structure, and that each night the angle would attempt to assert itself more forcefully, not through brute presence but through quiet incremental correction, patiently waiting for the moment she grew tired enough to look straight at the world again. Lena stopped thinking in terms of haunting and began thinking in terms of calibration, because what moved through her house did not rattle chains or whisper threats but adjusted variables, testing load-bearing assumptions about vertical and horizontal, about center and edge, and she realized that fatigue was the entity's greatest ally. By the sixth night her muscles ached from deliberate imbalance, from never standing evenly, from keeping her gaze perpetually softened, and the cabin felt like a maze she had designed to confuse an architect that lived inside light. She brewed bitter coffee and left the mug deliberately near the edge of the counter at a crooked angle, watching how the liquid surface trembled as if responding to a vibration too low to hear. The hum began again, not loud but pervasive, a resonance that seemed to originate inside her skull rather than in the walls, and she sensed that the distortion was no longer merely altering space but probing perception directly. The diagonal seam along the north wall had lengthened overnight, branching into a faint geometric pattern like a hairline fracture spreading through glass, and when she observed it indirectly she saw depth within it, a sliver of a room leaning at a different degree where shadows fell in the wrong direction. She forced herself to move unpredictably, pacing in erratic steps, knocking a lamp slightly askew, shifting the table another inch off-center. Yet the pressure continued to build, subtle and relentless. Suddenly every object in the kitchen vibrated in unison, a synchronized tremor that suggested the entity had found a reference point despite her efforts. The mug slid across the counter not toward the floor but toward the center of the room, aligning itself with invisible coordinates. Lena resisted the urge to lunge for it and instead tilted her head sharply, breaking the symmetry of her own posture, and the mug halted mid-slide as though confused. The overhead light dimmed and the air thickened, gravity tugging sideways rather than down, and she felt her thoughts begin to straighten against her will, sentences forming cleanly in her mind, interpretations sharpening into clarity. She understood with a flash of cold insight that the entity was refining not the house but her cognition, smoothing out uncertainty, encouraging her to resolve blur into precision. Elias's memory surfaced again, fragmented but urgent. "It cannot finish unless you agree with it." Lena began to speak aloud in contradictions, mismatched phrases, half-formed ideas, disrupting the neat alignment of language, and she staggered deliberately, scraping a chair across the floor at an uneven angle. The diagonal seam in the wall pulsed faintly, widening enough that she glimpsed beyond it the outline of the wooden chair from the lake, now positioned in that adjacent tilted cabin, the journal open as if recording her resistance. The hum intensified into a high ringing tone and for a moment she felt herself tipping, not physically but perceptually, as though her inner sense of upright was rotating to match the other room. Panic threatened to focus her vision, to snap everything into terrifying clarity, but she squeezed her eyes halfway shut and let tears blur the edges, clinging to distortion as a shield. The ringing fractured into discordant vibrations and the seam flickered, the adjacent cabin slipping out of phase. The mug dropped abruptly to the floor and shattered, liquid spreading in an irregular stain that defied clean lines. Silence followed, heavy and uncertain. When Lena opened her eyes fully, the kitchen remained skewed but stable, the seam reduced again to a faint scar. She sank into a crouch amid broken ceramic and cooling coffee, understanding that the entity had attempted something new, not merely bending walls but persuading her to accept its corrections, and she knew that each encounter would grow subtler, targeting not wood or water but the quiet human instinct to make sense of what does not belong. By the seventh night Lena understood that resistance alone would not be enough because the entity was no longer pressing from outside the structure of the house but threading itself through her expectations, waiting for the smallest lapse in discipline, the smallest desire for clean alignment, and she sensed that exhaustion was shaping her thoughts into straighter lines. She avoided sleep as long as she could, pacing in uneven patterns through the cabin, shifting objects into deliberate imbalance, yet sometime before dawn she drifted into a shallow, fractured dream in which she stood once more at the lake, only this time the water reflected a sky perfectly symmetrical, clouds mirrored with impossible precision, and she felt a profound relief at the sight of something orderly. In the dream she stepped onto the dock and looked straight down without hesitation, and beneath the surface the room appeared not distorted but pristine, walls squared, the wooden chair standing evenly on all four legs, the journal resting centered upon the seat. Elias stood beside it, whole and upright, his head no longer tilted, his eyes clear and level as he said softly that it was easier this way, easier to let the angles correct themselves. Lena felt the seductive pull of that perfection, the comfort of a world where nothing leaned, where gravity behaved and corners met cleanly, and she understood with dawning horror that the entity's final strategy was not terror but relief. She woke abruptly in the dark cabin, heart pounding, and for a moment she could not tell whether she was still dreaming because the room around her felt unnervingly straight. The scattered books lay neatly stacked, the rug centered, the hallway chair standing balanced on all four legs. A cold wave passed through her as she realized she had not arranged the room this way. Slowly, carefully, she rose from the floor and sensed no hum, no vibration, only a suffocating stillness. She knew this was worse. The entity had achieved temporary symmetry while she slept. Resisting panic, she refused to look directly at any corner, instead scanning the room obliquely, and in the edge of her vision she saw faint lines in the air like guidelines drawn for construction, intersecting at precise angles across the walls and ceiling. The house had become a blueprint. From the kitchen came the soft scrape of wood, and she understood without seeing that the chair from the lake now sat centered in the room, perfectly aligned with the tiles. Elias's voice drifted through her memory again, not distorted but calm. It completes through agreement. Lena felt her thoughts trying to settle into clarity, her fear smoothing into rationalization, a whisper suggesting that perhaps nothing was wrong with straight lines, that perhaps she had misjudged the angle that did not belong. She recognized the temptation and acted before hesitation could crystallize. Shoving the nearest bookshelf with all her strength so it toppled sideways, books exploding across the floor in chaotic arcs. The crash shattered the stillness and the invisible guidelines flickered. She kicked the kitchen table off center, overturned the balanced chair, tore the rug diagonally across the boards. As disorder returned, the hum burst back violently, as though angered by disruption. The air rippled and the centered wooden chair revealed itself fully in the kitchen, the journal open, its pages filled with tight, precise handwriting she did not recognize. The walls trembled, corners straining to maintain right angles, and Lena felt the pressure surge against her perception again, urging her to look straight, to finalize the alignment. Instead she squeezed her eyes halfway shut and tilted her head sharply, forcing asymmetry into her own posture. The chair splintered along invisible stress lines, its perfect legs warping unevenly. The journal's pages tore down the middle as if the geometry sustaining them had fractured. A violent crack resounded through the cabin and the invisible blueprint shattered into drifting fragments of light. When silence returned, the house was crooked once more, uneven and imperfect. Lena sank against the wall, trembling but resolute, understanding now that the greatest danger was not distortion but perfection, and that as long as she rejected the comfort of a world made flawlessly straight, the angle that did not belong would remain incomplete. The eighth night did not begin with sound but with absence, a hollowness in the air as though the world had stepped back to watch, and Lena sensed immediately that the entity had shifted tactics again because the cabin remained crooked exactly as she had left it. No hum vibrating through the walls, no pressure bending gravity, only a quiet so absolute it felt staged. She moved cautiously through the rooms, maintaining her uneven posture, resisting the instinct to correct anything, and she noticed that even the diagonal seam along the north wall had faded to a faint discoloration, almost invisible. The lack of disturbance unsettled her more than the previous assaults, because silence implied calculation. Near midnight she felt a subtle internal sensation rather than an external one, a gentle straightening inside her thoughts, as if her mind were aligning itself without spatial cues. Memories of Elias began to rearrange, no longer fragmented and tilted but cleanly sequenced, their emotional jaggedness smoothing into coherence. And she realized with a chill that the entity had begun working within her cognition directly, bypassing architecture altogether. She sat at the kitchen table, deliberately off-center, and allowed her gaze to soften, scanning the room peripherally for anomalies, yet everything remained stubbornly ordinary. Then she noticed something far more dangerous. Her breathing had fallen into a perfect rhythm, symmetrical inhale and exhale, equal intervals of pause. Even her pulse felt steady and centered. The entity was seeking symmetry through biology. Lena disrupted it at once, altering her breath into irregular patterns, quick shallow pulls followed by long uneven releases, tapping her fingers against the table in arrhythmic beats. The sense of internal straightening faltered slightly but did not disappear. Instead she felt a conceptual shift, as though ideas themselves were lining up along invisible axes. She suddenly understood complex memories with startling clarity, connections snapping into place, grief resolving into acceptance. It was beautiful in a terrifying way. She could almost forgive the distortion for offering such elegant order, and in that moment she perceived the true seduction. Not the correction of space but the correction of pain. If everything aligned, loss might align too. Elias's absence might fit neatly into a comprehensible pattern. Tears blurred her vision as she recognized the temptation. She wanted alignment, she wanted closure. The room seemed to brighten subtly as her thoughts approached agreement. In the corner of her eye she saw faint intersecting lines forming again, not on the walls but suspended around her head like a delicate geometric halo. The wooden chair did not manifest physically this time, yet she sensed it conceptually, a focal point waiting for her to acknowledge it. She forced herself to remember the tilted version of Elias, the warning not to let it see her looking, and she deliberately summoned contradictions into her mind, recalling fragmented memories out of order, clinging to unresolved grief, refusing the comfort of neat conclusions. The geometric halo flickered. A low tremor rippled through the air, less violent than before but edged with frustration. The internal clarity began to fracture, thoughts scattering into imperfect shapes. She knocked her own mug from the table, letting it roll unpredictably across the uneven floor, and the small chaotic motion grounded her. The brightness dimmed. The sense of conceptual alignment retreated. Lena understood then that the entity was learning that perfection of mind could substitute for perfection of space, that if it could persuade her to reconcile every angle within herself it would no longer need to bend walls or water. As dawn approached the silence deepened once more, and she remained seated in deliberate asymmetry, breathing unevenly, guarding not just the structure of her house but the unresolved corners of her heart, knowing that the battle had moved inward and that the next attempt would likely target the most vulnerable angle of all: her longing to see Elias whole again. On the 9th night Lena made a decision that felt less like defiance and more like inevitability, because she understood the entity would never stop refining its approach and that endless resistance inside the cabin only delayed a convergence that had begun at the lake. So before dusk she walked back through the forest with uneven steps, refusing straight paths, letting her trajectory bend unpredictably between trees. The air felt neutral, almost gentle, and that frightened her more than distortion ever had. When the lake came into view its surface reflected the sky perfectly, too perfectly, clouds mirrored with photographic precision, horizon dividing water and air into symmetrical halves. She stopped at the edge and kept her gaze soft, studying the shoreline indirectly, and in her peripheral vision she saw the faint outline of the submerged room waiting beneath the reflection. She understood now that the entity did not merely want to align her perception but to close a circuit between observer and observed, to create a flawless feedback loop in which looking and being looked at became indistinguishable. The dock extended before her like a ruler drawn across the water, straight and narrow, and she stepped onto it at an angle, placing each foot deliberately off-center. The wood did not creak this time. Instead a low resonance vibrated outward across the lake as if acknowledging her arrival. She sensed Elias before she saw him, a presence suspended between dimensions. And when she allowed her peripheral vision to widen, she glimpsed his form beneath the surface, less distorted than before but still tilted slightly, as though caught between alignments. The wooden chair stood beside him in the submerged room, now perfectly balanced, the journal open on its seat. Lena felt the familiar pressure begin behind her eyes, urging her to look directly down and complete the symmetry. She realized that the entity had grown patient enough to offer her a bargain. One clear, centered gaze in exchange for restoration. The thought struck her with dangerous clarity. If she looked straight at Elias, if she accepted the alignment, perhaps he would emerge whole. Grief surged through her, nearly snapping her discipline. The lake brightened, reflection sharpening. She sensed the circuit nearing closure. But then she noticed something subtle in the corner of her vision. Elias was not looking at her directly. Even submerged, even partially corrected, his gaze was angled slightly away. He was refusing symmetry too. The realization steadied her. Instead of stepping forward, she pivoted sideways on the dock, breaking the linear path between herself and the lake's center, and she spoke aloud, not to Elias but to the space around him, refusing to define what she saw. The resonance intensified, water trembling as if pulled toward an invisible axis. The chair beneath the surface vibrated, legs lengthening to perfect equality. The journal's pages turned in rapid succession, seeking a final line. Lena felt the unbearable urge to finish it, to look and complete the sentence. Instead, she closed one eye and tilted her head sharply, distorting her own depth perception. The image beneath the lake fractured instantly, symmetry collapsing into skewed planes. Elias's outline flickered, no longer smoothing but resisting. The resonance spiked into a sharp crack that split across the water like lightning frozen in reflection. The perfectly mirrored sky shattered into chaotic ripples. The submerged room buckled, its walls bending outward at conflicting angles. The chair splintered along its joints. The journal snapped shut and dissolved into drifting fragments. A violent wave surged against the dock and Lena staggered but did not straighten her stance. She kept her posture uneven, her gaze unfocused, refusing every invitation to resolve the chaos. The lake roared for a heartbeat longer, then fell abruptly silent. When the surface settled, it reflected only the natural sky again, imperfect, clouds blurred by wind. Elias's figure was gone from view, but she sensed not loss this time, rather a suspension, as though he remained beyond reach yet no longer actively aligning with the entity. Lena stepped back onto the shore without ever looking straight down, heart aching but resolute, understanding that she had refused the bargain and broken the near-complete circuit, and that whatever confrontation remained would not be about rescue or restoration but about ending the angle's claim entirely. The 10th night arrived without omen, no hum in the walls, no tremor in the ground, only a stillness so ordinary it felt deliberate, and Lena understood with quiet certainty that the entity had withdrawn not in defeat but in consolidation, gathering whatever fragments of alignment still lingered between her perception and the world. She remained by the lake after sunset, seated on the uneven shoreline with one shoulder lowered and her gaze unfixed, watching the water indirectly as darkness settled across it. The surface reflected the stars imperfectly, wind bending their shapes into trembling lines, and she recognized that imperfection as fragile protection. Grief moved through her in uneven waves, no longer sharp but unresolved, and she allowed it to remain unresolved, resisting the human instinct to turn pain into pattern. Hours passed in silence until she sensed a final shift, not in space but in awareness, as though something vast had leaned close for one last evaluation. The air did not vibrate, the water did not distort, yet she felt the unmistakable presence of the angle waiting for her to make a choice. Images rose in her mind unbidden. The perfectly straight cabin, the balanced chair, Elias whole and level, a world corrected into elegant order. She felt how easily she could accept it now, how exhaustion made symmetry tempting, how longing made alignment merciful. The entity did not need to bend reality anymore, it only needed her consent. Lena closed her eyes halfway, not in refusal but in recognition, and spoke softly into the night that she would not trade distortion for certainty, would not exchange love for geometry. She admitted that she wanted Elias back, wanted clarity, wanted straight lines she could trust. But wanting did not require agreement. As she held that imperfect truth within her, the presence around her shifted subtly, not retreating but recalculating. She sensed the angle, probing for contradiction and finding none, because her acceptance of uncertainty left no edge for it to straighten. The lake remained dark and irregular. A breeze rippled its surface into asymmetrical patterns. Minutes stretched into an hour and nothing aligned. Gradually the sense of scrutiny thinned, dissolving into the vast background of ordinary night. Lena did not feel triumph, only quiet endurance. She understood that the entity might never vanish entirely, that somewhere beyond human axes it would continue to exist, but without her agreement it could not complete the fold. When dawn finally bled across the horizon, the water reflected it unevenly, clouds fractured by wind, colors blending without precision, and she felt a fragile stability settle over the world. Elias was still gone, the mystery unresolved, the pain uncorrected, yet the angles around her no longer pressed inward. She rose slowly, maintaining her uneven stance out of habit rather than fear, and walked away from the lake without once seeking a centered reflection. Behind her the water shimmered in imperfect light, holding its secrets without symmetry, and though the angle that did not belong still existed somewhere beyond sight, it no longer had a place to anchor itself within her perception, leaving the world flawed, unfinished, and safely askew.